Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of Heart to Heart. My name is Kevin Ring. I'm president of FAMM, and today we're talking about our favorite topic, which is rolling back mandatory minimum sentences. FAMM was founded 30 years ago with that mission in mind. And so when Julie Stewart founded the group, she thought she needed about 5 years to convince people that these were unjust and counterproductive laws and that we were going in the wrong direction. But here we are 30 years later, still fighting away. And there have been some backward slides, and then there's been some forward momentum. And right now, I think we are moving forward, and states around the country are revisiting these laws, and we're really excited about that. And we're excited to have three panelists, three advocates from different states to talk about what's happening in their jurisdiction in the fight against mandatory sentences. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and tell a little bit about their organizations and their work. And I'll start with you, Sarah. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, and it's really a pleasure and an honor to be with this panel today, doing such incredible work, such important work, and I'm very excited to share the context and the work from New Jersey and really learn about the other work that our panelists are doing. So, Sarah Fajardo, I'm the policy director of ACLU New Jersey. ACLU works on a range of issues. We were founded in 1960 in New Jersey, and really our focus for our entire history has been looking at ways that we can eliminate and limit the onerous, punitive, and racially disparate impact of systems, and specifically the criminal legal system in New Jersey. So happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
How long have you been with ACLU?
About 2 years. My anniversary is on April Fool's Day, but it's been no joke. It's been real work. Yeah.
All right, well, thanks for joining us. And Patrice?
Thank you. I'm Patrice Sultan. I'm the executive director of DC Justice Lab, which is an organization in the District of Columbia that develops public safety solutions that are evidence-driven, community-rooted, and racially just. And I'm a huge fan of all of FAMM's work and really excited to be joining you. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Yeah, we're glad you're here. And Andy?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Andy Elders. I'm with Justice Forward Virginia. We are, I think, Virginia's only issue advocacy group that lobbies exclusively on criminal justice reform issues. I am also a public defender. I'm the deputy public defender in Fairfax County. And as you can see, I'm wearing a tie today as a result. I'm really excited to be here. Mandatory minimums is the one issue that I have been most closely tied to over the last several years at Justice Forward. And we're really excited to make the case for their abolition here and anywhere else someone will listen.
Yeah, well, Andy, I'll start with you because we just worked together in a campaign in Virginia to repeal the laws. Why don't you give a little bit of background and how things went?
Sure. I'll try to give you sort of the shortish version as best I can. I'm not good at short versions. We had a lot of support behind getting rid of mandatory minimums in Virginia to some extent. The fault lines turned out to be there was a bill from our Senate that would have gotten rid of mandatory minimums completely, full abolition. There was a bill from our House that would have gotten rid of basically drug and some minor traffic mandatory minimums, but left many of them in place for things like firearms, sex crimes, other offenses that are deemed more pernicious and therefore less worthy of individualized sentencing in the minds of some. Our crime commission, which included a lot of House leadership and Senate leadership, had voted for full abolition. But when push came to shove, they could not reach a compromise, meaning effectively, in my view, the House was unwilling to reach the right policy, which is full abolition. As a result, nothing happened this session, and the parties are all vowing to come back to the table and try to get something done in the next session. Of course, in Virginia, there is an intervening election. So that could mean bad things for the future of getting rid of mandatory minimums. But if the election goes well, maybe everyone will feel a little more secure and we'll be in a better position to do something that I guess they view as more courageous. I just view it as good policy.
Yeah. I mean, a heartbreaking end, sort of, we felt like, for those who could have benefited from reform that they didn't get done. But I mean, encouraging that the choice was between full abolition and repeal of drug mandatory minimums and making it retroactive. So at least headed in the right direction, right?
Yeah, very much so. And I agree with you. There was a lot of, I had very strong expectations that something good was going to get done this session. And I think there were a lot of dynamics, along with the fact that Virginia's way is sort of to, maybe you put something up once and people argue about it and it doesn't quite get done, and then they come back and take another look at it and suddenly everybody's position is different. But yeah, it's certainly a good sign in the sense of where people are pointed ideologically. It was a little disappointing, to say the least, for this particular session, but a lot of other good things got done. So we're going to keep a brave face on, and we're going to come back for mandatory minimums next week.
Yeah, and it was a short session, and you guys had a lot of other reforms that were accomplished as well. Sarah, can you catch us up on where New Jersey is?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. You know, this changes every day for us, but it's been a long road that we're still walking together. About, I think, over a year ago now, Governor Murphy had convened a bipartisan sentencing reform commission to do a really deep dive and look at New Jersey's sentencing policy and identify and come to an agreement, right, amongst parties, across party, amongst stakeholders in our state for reform that we can all agree on and that we can all move forward on. This bipartisan sentencing commission, about a year ago, last month, I believe, issued a report with its recommendations, including a recommendation to repeal mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent offenses, with the exception of one mandatory that still remains for us related to robbery, second-degree robbery, and burglary. We have a mandatory minimum associated with parole qualifications. So that was included in the recommendation body because of the number of folks that are sentenced with that with those charges, and because often those charges are not associated with a violent act directly, and so they were subject matter related to the other mandatory minimum recommendation. You know, the ACLU-NJ categorically opposes mandatory minimum sentences as a policy matter, and you know, I think I'll find agreement on this call with folks about that, about you know, the inefficacy of long and onerous sentences as a deterrent or building towards public safety. I won't revisit that ground. So long story short, I'll try to keep this short too. New Jersey then had these sentencing recommendations in our hands, and different legislators across the body picked different pieces up. And so some have passed through already related to sentencing reform, related to compassionate release, related to juvenile sentencing. But still, the nonviolent mandatory minimum bill languished. It was moving in our legislature. An amendment was included to include a body of sentences that were not part of the recommended sentencing recommendations. And it became a political fight, right? And so this has been a tough fight. Our position is that we support the expansion of this bill to include all mandatory minimum sentences. It's been expanded beyond the initial recommendations. And then it passed through our legislature. And so it's sitting now on our governor's desk, and we are, engaging partners across the state to try to find a way forward to encourage Governor Murphy to sign. If he chooses to conditionally veto or veto, we are committed to finding a way forward to make sure that this repeal actually does happen. So I'm happy to say more, but trying to be respectful of time. Oh, you're muted.
Yes. Well, what were the votes like in your legislature? I mean, so the repeal, at least of the nonviolence, passed both the House and the Senate. I mean,
Indeed.
Was that bipartisan? What were your margins like?
It was bipartisan. I believe that we had a little bit of wiggle room beyond our 41 in the Assembly. It's tough because some of our hearings and voting sessions have been in person. And so I think, folks are making their own decision about coming in person to vote. And so I won't speculate, but I suspect that we may have had more support for the bill, but perhaps not.
Yeah, well, that's encouraging, though.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is legislative support, and we know that Governor Murphy is committed to sentencing reform. We all just need to get there together.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we're waiting for that bill to be signed with everybody else, and we hope that gets done. All right, Patrice, DC, what are our prospects there? What do we have to look forward to attack mandatories in DC?
Well, the district put together a 26-member task force on jails and justice, which just released its report with 80 recommendations for how to transform DC's criminal legal system. And one of those recommendations is to eliminate all statutory and mandatory minimums in our criminal code. So in some sense, we're behind these other states because we don't have anything introduced yet. But on the positive side, there haven't been any limitations. There's been no line drawing happening in the conversations that are going on so far. DC also formed a criminal code reform commission to fully revise our penal code, and the draft recommendations to date don't include any mandatory minimum sentences, again, without drawing lines between violent or nonviolent offenses or other lines like that. So unlike some of these other states, we don't have a House and a Senate. We have a 13-member council. And if we can get 7 people to commit to making this change, we might actually see something happen in DC sooner rather than later. DC Justice Lab is new, and it's one of the first things that we wanted to tackle because we think it's so important, and we're pretty committed to seeing this through and are grateful to have FAMM's support along the way.
Yeah, tell us more about DC Justice Lab in terms of, what other issues besides this? You're talking about a total code rewrite. So what are the types of things they're looking at doing?
Well, the Criminal Code Reform Commission, which was a body that the council created, is tasked with fully rewriting all of the offense definitions, all of the penalties, and it's really a restructuring of the entire code. DC Justice Lab is working on the entire criminal legal system, but focused just on the District of Columbia. And that's one of the things that we plan to work on when that revised code comes out. It's the job that I had before I started DC Justice Lab. And we're also working on things like criminal record sealing, ending solitary confinement, and a huge suite of policing proposals. And even in the context of talking about policing, I serve on our newly formed Police Reform Commission. There's been recognition that just assigning really harsh penalties isn't doing anything. It's missing the mark. It's the symbolic gesture, even in the policing context, to say we're going to add a 10-year offense here, we're going to add a mandatory minimum there. People are starting to recognize and talk about the fact that that's not actually addressing any of the social problems. So I think the conversation is moving in the right direction. I just want it to be moving a little bit more quickly.
Yeah, no, I'm just, I have to shout out DC because the DC Second Look law that passed and early this year was signed. To me, that's a model for second chances to give people, who are serving long sentences. And in some ways, I think those sort of concepts are connected because in some ways, the reason I think a second look law is a good idea, and for those who are listening and don't know, a second look law allows somebody to get the opportunity to get a new sentence after 10, 15 years, whatever is set up. And sometimes changing the mandatories or changing the sentences on the front end is hard to do because you're squarely going after crimes that scare people, at least they sound scarier. Whereas second look, you can say, regardless of what you did, after 15 years, we're going to take a look to make sure, the sentence that you might have got, which would have been excessive, is appropriate. So I love the fact that DC has the second look in place for everybody under 25 and now is going after mandatory sentences. And I want to ask you, in terms of the fight over mandatories, I sort of view these in 2 buckets, which is the water feels warm to go after drug mandatory minimums because I think it's just because of a changing attitude about drugs. I think mandatory minimums are seen as a proxy for harshness, that if we really were serious about something, then we pass a mandatory minimum for it. And then I think there's people like us who view mandatory minimums not as a proxy for harshness, but as a way of not allowing individualized sentencing and individualized justice. So the concept bothers us, but I still think we have work to do. But in the realm of drugs, this is changing, yes?
Yeah, I think so. Virginia is increasingly taking a more progressive view about how to sentence nonviolent crime, certainly, and even what to do with people who have previously been sentenced on nonviolent offenses. I think things are definitely changing in terms of drugs. I think there's a broad consensus that courts, whether it's judges or juries in Virginia, because juries often fix punishments in Virginia, should be able to use their discretion to come to fair sentence arrangements, including some no jail time at all. And what I see in my practice in Fairfax, and what we see in a lot of places in Virginia, is on drug offenses, people are much less sanguine about punishment. I think you're right that as a political matter, people tend to conflate mandatory minimums with harshness in punishment. And, we're constantly messaging that mandatory minimums have so many effects that go beyond just the sentence itself, that sentencing policy sort of reverberates all the way back through the entire criminal justice system, including even up to the point of arrest. But I agree with you completely. I think we're really coming around on drugs. I think that Virginia has the pieces in place to do reform on mandatory minimums for drugs. It's a matter of trying to decide what to do with everything else.
Yeah, and I don't think it's any accident that you're seeing Oregon decriminalize, drug possession, small quantities of drugs. South Dakota legalize marijuana. Virginia, you all just did. I mean, there's problems with that bill, I know, but so you're seeing this change in attitude about punishing drug use. Sarah, is that the environment or atmosphere in New Jersey that led to the recommendations from your sentencing commission?
I think it's certainly related and integrated. So marijuana legalization and decriminalization had been a campaign priority for our governor, and we had agreement across both houses in our legislature, the leadership of both houses in our legislature, that legalizing cannabis was a really strong and important move to build racial justice in our state. We knew that we had over 30,000 arrests yearly for cannabis-related arrests, and mostly possession and mostly low-level amounts of marijuana. And so, and we had a racial disparity rate of 3 to 1, 3 Black folks arrested for every 1 white person arrested for cannabis possession. And so, with all of that information and data setting the stage to talk about our criminal justice system, we have seen this kind of trickle over to a conversation about removing mandatory minimums for nonviolent drug offenses, and how New Jersey is treating drugs a little bit more broadly in the context of cannabis legalization, which for folks who haven't been really enmeshed in our fight for that over the last few years, it really came to a head this year. We just passed legislation recently to legalize, and the governor signed it, my goodness, last month. It's all a wash, but recently to finally legalize cannabis. But in that conversation, it got broadened, right, by what was happening in Oregon, what was happening in Virginia, what was happening across the country in other contexts, and more broadly beyond cannabis, right? I feel like this was just the tip of the iceberg. And so in that conversation, conversations about regrading psilocybin happened, and we started hearing folks really talk about the significant punishment that is attached to cannabis, psilocybin, other drugs. And so psilocybin was regraded to a disorderly persons offense in the course of the marijuana legalization fight. And really, we and many of our partners across the state of New Jersey are eager to talk more about decriminalizing all drugs, to moving towards that context. So I dove deep on the drug-related question, but it's certainly related to mandatory minimums. And I'd love to hear more from other folks if you want, but we've been talking a lot about the violent, nonviolent dichotomy.
Oh yeah, we're gonna get to that.
Sorry.
But I want to ask Patrice, because Patrice, you mentioned that DC Justice Lab, part of your mission is racial justice. That's how you're looking at this. And we've had reform of mandatory sentences over the past 20 years. A lot of states have reformed or repealed. But I noticed, bill to repeal introduced in California, the Virginia effort, the New Jersey effort, and I couldn't help but think a lot of this was driven out of last summer, and this idea where polls for the first time hit 69% of Americans said that they think Black people are treated worse by the criminal justice system than white people. And that mandatory minimums, especially for drugs, are seen through that lens, that this is a place that if you want to advance racial justice and criminal justice, repealing mandatory minimums is one way to do that. Can you address that?
Yes, well, DC is interesting because our entire criminal legal system is almost entirely Black. We don't have the same stratification of race in every socioeconomic class in DC. There aren't really any poor white people who live in our communities, and our prison system, our arrest data, our sentencing data is all 85, 90, 95, 99% Black people. And so anytime we talk about adjusting our criminal legal system to be more fair, it's a racial justice issue in DC, and our cannabis decriminalization and legalization effort here was really a racial justice effort spearheaded by our local ACLU and a lot of other organizers in the city. So the mandatory minimums that are on our books are affecting almost exclusively Black people as well. And yeah, I mean, it's hard to even parse it or to make a pie chart like you might in another state, because it's all just going to be a circle in the district. And so the rhetoric that led to each of those changes oftentimes was really highly racially charged. And it's clear who was being targeted by enforcement anytime a mandatory minimum was added to the books.
So let's get to the hard cases. I thought what was interesting in Virginia was not just the usual. I testified in Pennsylvania a number of years ago. Their court struck down their mandatory minimums for a constitutional sort of procedural reason, not because of, an Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual, but they struck them down. I testified, and I remember a prosecutor testifying and said, if we don't restore this mandatory minimum for raping children, we're going to have a lot more children raped in this state. And I just thought, this is such a preposterous claim, and yet no one's going to call them on it, right? I mean, it was great to bang the table and scare everybody with what's considered kind of like the worst offender. But I noticed we had some of that in Virginia, but then we also had Mothers Against Drunk Driving saying, if we don't have mandatory minimums for repeat drug driving offenses, that's going to lead to problems. And that's a sympathetic sounding group. And so again, it was sort of like, well, if you care about this problem, then you should support this solution. And so, Andy, help us think, and how do we explain to people that it's the process itself, it's the system that denies individualized sentencing and cuts the judges out that is the biggest problem with mandatory sentences?
I mean, there's so many things that factor into that question. A lot of the cases that I work are sex cases, child and adult sex cases, or crimes of violence. Virginia is interesting because mandatory minimums don't, generally speaking, apply to murder in Virginia, of all things. But lots of sex cases, child sex cases, adult sex cases carry mandatory minimums. So that becomes a focal point of opposition to mandatory minimum reform. Needless to say, there's a lot of counter arguments, the most important being what I referred to earlier, which is that setting a punishment and setting an extremely harsh punishment or denying individualized sentencing doesn't only affect what happens at the sentence. It obviously coerces people into pleas. It affects the decisions judges make about whether to hold people pre-trial. It affects how much it costs to get a lawyer, which affects what you might get in the private market, and then affects whether or not you qualify potentially for court-appointed counsel. So there's all these different things that go into that effect that minimum has on the rest of the system. I tell people that if you were charged with an extraordinarily serious offense, no one would argue that you should have fewer jurors or that you should not get to cross-examine a witness. But they're perfectly willing to infringe on someone's due process right to have an individualized sentence in which the judge and the jury who hear the actual facts of the case get to decide what the punishment should be. So there's that. To me, one of the biggest things that we were talking about toward the end, when people were talking a lot about sex cases, is that so many of the people who are charged with and have committed sex offenses, particularly against children, were themselves victimized in their youth. We see that pattern often, not all the time, but we see it a lot. And obviously, whether or not someone is concerned for victims, I guess only extends so far. And that's something that, I've had a lot of clients with some very sad stories, clients who learned patterns of behavior at a very young age, and as a result, never really got to turn their lives around. And that is a story that juries and judges should hear when deciding what's appropriate, because it's cruel enough to say to someone who was themselves victimized or saw violence in their home, that now you're going to pay the price for the things you internalized as a child. It's even worse to hide that information or tell a jury or a judge that that information doesn't matter. You can't take it into account. You have to give this person, in some cases in Virginia, mandatory life. And so that's heartbreaking as an advocate and as someone who litigates on behalf of people who have had these stories. So I think it's a really important thing to push on all of these different fronts, that individualized sentencing is important for sentencing, and it's also important for trials.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And in other systems, in the federal system, it drives the guidelines. It affects everybody's sentence. Even having mandatory minimums in one place in a code drives all sentences because they keep up. Sarah, I know you wanted to get in on this topic, so take your shot.
Sure, and I really appreciated that framing from Andy to look at kind of the impact of this practice on all aspects of the system, and thinking through better ways to support folks, right, who have experienced trauma, who have had really tough experiences in their lives. We know there's such a growing body of research and well-established information that long, harsh sentences are really not, a rehabilitative tool that's effective. And so zooming out, thinking through how to support folks, prevent people from coming into these criminal legal systems. And then, New Jersey's been doing a lot of work on trying to release folks from prison during COVID-19 to, reforming mandatory minimums. It's all part of a cohesive and hopefully research-backed and public health-focused response to folks.
Yeah, and I think, in the drug context, we've been able to say we're seeing people, low-level dealers or addicts, get sentences that were like written for El Chapo, right? And the truth is that in every context, that's true. Lawmakers can't possibly foresee all the circumstances that their law is going to be compared to. And the famous one to me is, or infamous one is, the production of child pornography. People think this is the worst crime, and put even aside Andy's, good point about maybe this is driven by some prior abuse that the person has suffered. People just viscerally react to that. And then we saw in the States, it was being applied to 18-year-olds with 16-year-old girlfriends who were sending each other, pictures of one another. They were producing child pornography. That's what they almost charged former Congressman Anthony Weiner with. It's like you see in every place that mandatories exist, you start to see prosecutors use them in cases that were clearly not envisioned by the legislature when they passed them. Patrice, do you want to get in on that?
Absolutely. I think the point about individuated sentencing is so important. The law students who are working with me on researching changes to DC's mandatory minimums were challenged by me to answer the question, what about the most serious offenses, right? What are you going to say when someone asks you why we should eliminate the mandatory minimum for first-degree murder while armed? And the cases that they pointed to were cases of young women who in the last couple of years have been prosecuted for murdering people who were trafficking them. So looking at Crystal Kaiser's case, looking at Centoya Brown's case, and explaining that the reason we have these big GoFundMes, right? The reason that we have people trying to get them acquitted of something that they might have actually met all of the offense elements for doing is that we know that if they are convicted, there is no opportunity for the judge to say, this is a version of taking a life that doesn't deserve a period of imprisonment of 30 years or more, right? There's just no opportunity for the judge to look at the individuated circumstances of that case, let alone the person involved in that case. And so I thought that that was a very thoughtful example for them to include. And when I'm looking at these second look cases as they're coming back in, you'll notice that the resentencing hearings are really, really involved. The number of experts who come in, the fact witnesses who come in, and it really makes you wonder, why is that not happening at the outset when we're doing sentencing at the trial stage or at the plea stage, right? Like, why is the court not considering as much information as it possibly can about the person who's being sentenced, instead of just where to fit this offense into a guideline range that's been predetermined?
Yeah, I bet Andy's got an answer for that. I mean, I bet, I think a lot of times, how much information do you have? I mean, especially if you're triaging cases, and how much information do you have? How much time do you have to assemble that sort of life record and story and backstory before you can get to a sentence?
I think if you're talking about a serious felony sentencing, which I think is the context we're talking about, we get a lot of good information in front of judges. We have sort of a two-stage sentencing process for trials, at least. Your jury fixes a punishment, and then you try to convince a judge to reduce it. So we have a lot of information that gets to a jury, but it's very frustrating, obviously, in many of our cases in which that sentencing information and all of the mitigation in this person's life story falls not on deaf ears, but on where the jury can hear it and experience it and understand it, and then is powerless to do anything about it.
Yeah.
So that's it's hard to see because you see jurors put into a position where they want to exercise mercy, and there's this law that is a literal prohibition on mercy, and the jurors are just left to wonder, why aren't we allowed to say what we think? Why doesn't what we believe about this case matter? And for whether it's a jury or a judge, we pick those people carefully in different processes, but we pick those people carefully, and then we tie their hands, and it's tragic in many cases.
And we've got a question about your point about how mandatory minimums affect not only sort of the individual justice in the case, but throughout the system. Can you elaborate on that a little more?
Sure. I'll use sort of a case study relating to child solicitation, which touches a little bit on a topic you just mentioned. When people think about, someone's trying to, snatch a kid up on the internet, or trying to make sexual contact with, a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old on the internet, that person deserves a really harsh punishment. And sometimes they do it, sometimes they don't, I suppose. But we had a patch of cases just when COVID hit here in Fairfax. The Fairfax County Police Department undertook an effort they called Operation Kovid, where 5 or 6 detectives went on the internet and pretended to be children for the purpose of trying to sting people who were wanted to solicit, and by solicit I mean talk to, not try to actually make contact with, children on the internet for sexual purposes. But they didn't go to places where they knew that people were soliciting children. They didn't go to websites that children frequent. Instead, they went to adult dating websites. They found people with profiles that looked like they were looking for adults. They went on a website that children aren't even allowed to be on by their terms. They posted a profile of their own had a picture of a Fairfax County police officer who was in fact an adult, listed an adult age, and then they would chat these people up, and at some point during COVID, they would tell them, I'm 13 or I'm 12. And it's always 13 because 13 is the age at which our mandatory minimum 5 years kicks in for child solicitation if the person you're talking to is over 18. So the detectives create this crime. They engage with people who had no interest, no intention of talking to children. Most of the people we talk to say, I knew that wasn't a child. I was just either screwing around with that person, or there was fantasies going on, or that's what I thought they were into. And for various reasons, they talk to that person for a while. They ask them to do this or that, or tell them they want them to do this or that. And then the police rain down on them, and every offense is a 5-year mandatory minimum. And inevitably, our prosecutors will offer as a concession a 2-year sentence with a 2-year floor. And that's the plea offer in those cases. So when someone gets charged with an offense, first of all, it even goes before arrest, because the detectives created that crime around the minimum. They did that on purpose. They know exactly what they're doing. And they do that so that they can garner convictions, so they can put out a press release or go back and get their funding requests in to say, this program is getting all these people who would otherwise be molesting children, none of which actually are. So it goes before arrest. Once that person gets arrested, when someone goes to arrest them, it's not, they don't write them an email or call them on the phone and say, hey, we'd like to bring you in. Please come meet us at the police station. They go in with, they knock down their doors and they raid their houses and they look for child porn, which they never find because those people aren't interested in child pornography. And then they arrest them and bring them in. When it's time to set a bond or for there to be a bond reduction hearing, the court says, well, there's a mandatory minimum in place and there's a presumption against bond, which we got rid of in this past session. But and so they get held. And when their plea offers, you heard about what happens with the plea offers because the prosecutors know the leverage they have. And as a result, we have not been able to try those cases. It's been very hard to get people to try those cases because if they're starting at 5 and they get offered 2, guess what they want to do, even for people who know they're not guilty. And as a little coda on this story, our chief, Don Budarak, tried one of our cases in 2 weeks ago. The jury was out for 45 minutes before they acquitted. And we had a number of jurors who wrote back, one of whom talked about how outraged he was at what the police and prosecution were doing with these cases and how he expected the facts to be so much worse than he sat down than they actually were. And I think it's really illustrative of the effect that these things can have. How many of the people in our office, where we try lots of cases, how many people would have been acquitted if that mandatory minimum hadn't been in place, if that prosecutor hadn't had that leverage, if they hadn't been looking at 12 to 18 months of pretrial detention as a result of that mandatory minimum? It warps everything in the system, and it makes an enormous amount of difference about whether justice is done. Kevin, I think you're muted.
We did a documentary called The Vanishing Trial to talk about the way that mandatory minimums bludgeon people into giving up their constitutional rights. And I always think, I can't think of another constitutional right that people forfeit so frequently. That's so important, so vital to our founders. And yet, Andy, you made a point earlier, like, I think if you put that up for a vote, the tough on crime crowd would take that away and just say, why would we giving these guilty people a chance to get off? I mean, it's just so amazing how those protections, which are for everybody, someday you may need them, get lost when we have a moral panic about a given crime. Sarah, do you want to talk about, I think Andy has a good point. I don't think people realize how often people plead guilty just because they're threatened with a long sentence, and how does that distort the system for everybody?
Sure, I can speak really briefly about it, but I think, Andy, you really covered it well. We do know that there's immense power in the prosecutorial hands, right? And that mandatory minimums really invest prosecutors with incredible leverage. And we really are concerned. In New Jersey, we're interested and planning to do much more work on prosecutorial accountability and transparency. We have appointed prosecutors in New Jersey. And so there is a level of accountability that, other DAs across the country have that we don't. And so, it really does create this imbalance of power that is troubling, not non-transparent, right? These conversations can happen and people can get pressured. And, we really do want to return and invest our judges with judicial discretion and our juries with much more discretion and ability to right size and respond to individual needs and circumstances.
All right, so Patrice, you have a tough on crime lawmaker who says, this crime is so serious and so bad, I cannot possibly vote to take away a mandatory minimum because in some cases, I don't trust the judge to give the right punishment. What's the best argument? What do you think is the best argument to say to somebody who thinks, because I think a lot of it is that it's I don't want my hands on a law that gave a judge discretion that then may be abused. I think there is just a lot of distrust of judges, but what would you say is the best argument? A family member here's watching it, they want to call their lawmaker and tell them to get rid of mandatories. What would you tell them is the best thing?
I like to focus on the fact that it doesn't work. And I like to focus on the criminogenic effects that these policies have, right? If you can get people to understand that it's actually making us less safe to have bad laws on the books, I think that's really powerful. We saw in DC a spike recently in carjackings during the course of the pandemic. And I thought to myself, what a great illustration of how incredibly ineffective mandatory minimum sentencing is. Our carjacking statute has, if you want to think of it this way, not the highest mandatory minimum in our law, but the harshest, because it has this notwithstanding language that means you can't get a Youth Act sentence. You can't do anything with this sentence. And it's 7 years unarmed, 15 years for armed carjacking, right? Steeper penalty for taking someone's car than for taking someone's kid. And it does nothing, right? That's the having a low penalty is not what's causing people to take people's cars, right? It's things like the social circumstances people are finding themselves in during this global crisis. So I think it's helpful to frame things in that light when you do see, trends in crime or trends in law enforcement, to be able to point to the fact that, wow, the sentencing isn't what's actually driving the conduct, or the authorized penalties are not what's driving the conduct. They're actually just pulling families apart and making things worse for us in the long run.
Well, you won, because that's the right answer. No, I think for lawmakers especially, and as advocates, we can delude ourselves into thinking that what they're thinking they have to vote for is public safety. And so the best argument is to go right at the heart of that, which is that mandatory minimums don't make us safer. And if you look at even like the federal drug mandatory minimums, which have been in place since 86 and 88, drug use is the same rate today. We've drove up incarceration. In all of these areas, mandatory minimums, don't make us safer. And in fact, I don't think people realize that there's criminologists and social scientists who are sort of left-leaning, right-leaning. All of them, they disagree on police, defunding the police. They disagree on bail, other stuff. There is not a criminologist of any stripe who supports mandatory minimum sentences, because everyone knows the important thing is precision. You want to get the precise sentence. And when you have a one-size-fits-all tool, you're clearly going to waste resources and prison space on somebody who doesn't need it to send a message. And you're going to have fewer resources to spend on things that might actually work. Andy, you're talking to lawmakers all the time. And look, I'm going to say, we're FAMM, we represent families who are affected by this. I do think the impact on families, the collateral damage that's done to innocent family members is undercounted in this equation. We raise that voice. But I do think lawmakers and electeds, they're thinking, we're in democracy, they want to get reelected. They think I've got to be keeping the community safe. Andy, how do you address that?
I think there's a couple different questions in there, so I'm going to just pick the one I like the best.
Always.
The reason I think that, in our case, we had one bill that did the right thing and full abolition. We had another bill that just applied to drugs. I kept expecting that the people who were in favor of the less reforming version, the drug version, were going to get up in public and get on social media and say why that was the right policy. And that never happened. Months of this process we went through, and no one ever said it is better to repeal some mandatory minimums, but not all of them. That some people deserve individualized sentencing and others don't. Some people deserve fair access to trials and others don't. It just didn't happen. And the only thing that I can deduce from what happened was that people were afraid of the mailers and the commercials that they were going to see with their opponents saying, my client voted to reduce sentences for child rapists. And that's tough. And the reality is that people are going to say those things about you no matter what you do. They're going to find a vote that you took, any positive criminal justice reform vote, and they're going to say it. And when you try to hedge your own bets and try to avoid taking tough votes by avoiding making the best policy, all you do is negotiate against yourself. You disappoint the people who are there looking for your help to get the right thing done, and you still get attacked just the same. I know, look, I don't mean to say that our legislators are cynical and craven, because I think everyone is trying to do the right thing, and everyone wants to make sure that they retain the power to do the right thing in the future. And there's a balancing act to be done there. But in our case, what was most frustrating to me was we went out with the help of some allies and got polling done in Virginia about mandatory minimum reform. And over again, the polling said that people favor, by small to large margins, depending on how you frame it, abolishing all mandatory minimums. And yet, here we are waiting for 2022. So I think the answer is the same. You need to make sure that people understand it's not just some radical group of advocates saying that we should get rid of mandatory minimums. It is basically, and including in Virginia, we have a fairly large group of prosecutors saying we should get rid of mandatory minimums as well, full abolition. So when you have a consensus behind the policy, it's really just a matter of taking the time to educate people and hoping that someone strikes the right chord with them and brings them around to the right position.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think in Virginia, it was implicit that what was at play was the politics. It was that this would be a tough vote, but we didn't really get to have the debate about, the merits about what that would have been. I mean, the hard thing always is, you're substituting your political judgment for politicians, right? They say, oh, this is a vote I can't handle, and you're saying, no, yes, it is, and you're stuck. But what wasn't clear was how much could get done. I mean, there was no talk about which ones would have been problematic to support, and that is hard. I want to ask you, Sarah, I mean, in New Jersey, was there any talk about going further, or was the the Sentencing Commission that developed your recommendations, was its mission just to talk about nonviolent, or was there a discussion about going broader?
I wasn't privy to being at that table, but I'm sure that the conversation was broader. The recommendations that came forward were nonviolent, specifically for nonviolent drug crimes and property crimes, but there have been emerging conversations across the state with advocates, with family members of folks who are incarcerated, formerly incarcerated folks. We're really lucky to have a strong coalition called the New Jersey Prison Justice Watch Coalition that's really grown in the last year through COVID, advocacy for family members who have loved ones inside. So very much within the FAMM model and inspiration for us. But yeah, I think the conversation currently for ACLU is really what we want to get this done, and then what comes next. We know that the bill currently on Murphy's desk isn't retroactive. So there is a retroactive bill that would apply for the sentences covered in the bill that is pending signature or action. So that's the next step. And then, the conversation 100% has to be, what more can we do? And I take really strongly a fellow panelist's point about kind of racially biased and imbued conversations about public safety and how that plays into elections. And, one of our goals is really to change the conversation about what public safety means in New Jersey, right? And how we build it and who are we building it for, and making sure that it's inclusive, it's not racially biased, and it's really getting to the heart of our community's needs.
Can we talk a little bit about how race and mandatory minimums intersect to create a harshness that doesn't serve public safety, right? I mean, it's not one group saying, well, I support public safety, and one group saying, I support racial justice, and so my value should trump it. It's that these enhancements, and that's a lot of times where people get caught. This is where I think you see a lot of racial biases, because there's more interactions with the justice system. Somebody may have more of a record. They're more likely to get enhancements. And so that produces the distortion. Andy, you must see this in practice. So can you talk about how, and I remember too in Virginia, in the fight about race, which was one of the talking points, then people said, oh yeah, maybe in drugs, but in this other area, there's not racial bias, so you guys shouldn't care about this, which is absurd. But people say that.
So, that's a little complicated, and I want to speak about that briefly, and then I want to talk about the bigger point. In Virginia, they had some data talking about, the Crime Commission had data talking about who is serving sentences for mandatory minimum offenses. And they found that certainly, I think among the data, I think Black people were serving 4 times disproportionately or 5 times disproportionately likely to serve a mandatory minimum sentence in Virginia. But they also pointed out that much of that came from drug and gun offenses and not from some of the quote unquote more serious offenses. I have a couple of issues there, one of which is that Virginia data does not distinguish between white people and Latinos. And I can tell you, as someone who works quite regularly with populations that are Spanish speaking, that they are certainly more disproportionately likely to get mandatory minimum sentences for sex offenses, at least where I work. Having said all that, none of that accounts for the effect that we've been talking about, which is how often someone is charged with a mandatory minimum offense and then pleads to and serves time for a non-mandatory minimum offense based on plea negotiations. That data didn't capture that, and that data didn't capture the discretion that prosecutors use in a way that I'm not trying to say that prosecutors are purposefully racially biased, but systemically racially biased to the extent that they, so you talked about enhancements in the literal sense where you have a mandatory minimum that comes from prior offenses. I'm just as concerned with when the prosecutors choose whether or not to charge someone with a mandatory offense, or whether they choose to break down an offense from a mandatory minimum to something that might allow, for example, for a probationary sentence. And those decisions are necessarily based on factors that the prosecutors consider, all of which are connected to our country's history of obviously disproportionately racial policing, and also the effect that historically courts and prosecutors have had when considering people who aren't like them compared to people who are like them. So if you look at someone's prior record, if you look at whether or not someone's been arrested, if you look at whether someone was quote unquote disrespectful to the police officer, if you look at whether the kind of offense it was, and certainly prosecutors look at an offense committed by a black person against a white person far more harshly than they look at other kinds of offenses. So all of these things echo through our history as a matter of racial justice. And to pretend that you can look at quote unquote objective factors and use your discretion in a way that ignores our country's history of racial discrimination against black people, particularly in the criminal justice system, is foolish. And the idea that you can separate it out as long as who's serving mandatory minimum sentences isn't disproportionate is not correct. And I'll remind you that the mandatory minimum data actually is racially disproportionate in Virginia. So that's a very long way of saying that, like every other time that people use the criminal justice system to try to punish people more harshly, it is always disproportionately used against black people for 100 historical and present day reasons.
Yeah, and Patrice, I want to ask you, there are times when people say, well, aren't mandatories a way? There's data that shows, a judge is more likely to give a shorter sentence to a white person than a black person, but then there's even a light-skinned black person than a darker-skinned black person, that all those sort of inherent biases, innate biases that come out from somebody, but it extends even to like, have they had lunch yet, right? Like it's all these different weird factors that in a human system are going to manifest themselves. So some people think, well, aren't mandatories the solution to that? Because then you're getting this fairness. And we talk about, well, that just transfers the discretion to the prosecutor. But what do you say to those who think, well, mandatories sound more fair because it's just, one size fits all and you get that uniformity we should want from a system?
I think that's been debunked in so many places. I think the same rationale led to the sentencing guidelines, and we've learned since the sentencing guidelines were put in place that they don't actually reduce those sorts of racial disparities. The disparities persist at the time of sentencing, and that's because there is bias in infecting the entire system. I think one way that mandatory minimum sentencing has made Black neighborhoods less safe in DC is that it really put fear in people about getting caught, right? There was an understanding that these drug laws are only going to be enforced in certain neighborhoods, and they're going to be enforced very heavily in those neighborhoods. And when I handled cases, because I was a criminal defense attorney for many years here as well, when I handled cases that were collateral attacks from the early 90s in DC, I was always shocked to really learn that there were so many young kids involved in this serious violent crime, as well as the drug game. And a lot of times when I'd interview people or hear testimony about what was happening, the reason that they started enlisting minors to do that work is because the mandatory minimums were put in place, right? And so those are the other kinds of consequences that we see as a result of bad policy, right? That's an example of how these policies make our communities less safe, and everybody's aware of the racial dynamic. Everybody knows if you live in a particular neighborhood in the city that the police are going to heavily police it, and that if you get caught, you're not going to come home. And I think it makes us all really, really worse off, especially when we look at kids' involvement.
Mm-hmm. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask you all to, I hope we've demolished the case for mandatory sentences, but I want you to let's close with some forward-looking and some optimism about what's coming. So Andy, I'm going to start with you, and we got a question about prospects. You got we elections in Virginia, and what may happen in the House or the governor's race that may change the dynamic, good or bad.
I see that question came in from our friends at the Humanization Project. I see you. That's good. Okay, so the answer to that question is, I think Virginia often legislates in sort of a two-step way. You get the message out, you start to get a push. Maybe you get across the finish line the first time. Maybe you need a little more time working with people. Maybe you make a couple tweaks here and there. I think that if we got a second chance in 2022, I remain very optimistic that this thing's going to get done. I would be hopeful that, especially if people had won another election, and if the people feel a little more comfortable in their seats, that they might be a little more willing to entertain something that they might think of as radical, but in fact is not. It's a big change, and we're asking for a big change, but I remain optimistic Virginia's going to get this done in 2022, and we're going to be there to push for it no matter what happens.
Yeah, and I should say, no one talks with a dog that doesn't bark. And yet, if you look, the senators who stood and voted for full repeal, let's see if that affects any of their races. My guess is it won't. And maybe then people will see the waters warmer, because they did take that vote. And
I'll say this for the Senate. Right? Yeah, I'll say this for this. Well, the Senate doesn't have elections coming up.
Oh, right.
But, there were a lot of senators that were not radicals that took that vote. And a lot of senators who just saw it as good policy. And I think there were a lot of members of the House that were ready to take that vote too. So that gives me some confidence based on conversations that we have with individual people that we're going to be able to get this done. So,
okay, that sounds good. Here. All right, Sarah, when do we get Governor Murphy to sign that bill?
Soon. We're hopeful that we'll see action soon. We're hopeful that we'll see the repeal of the mandatory minimums covered in the bill. And ACLU would support more than that soon. And, I think looking forward, the movement to expand the repeal of mandatory minimums in New Jersey is really going to be driven by folks on the ground, our grassroots allies, and folks who work very closely with us and partners to change minds about, like I said, public safety, building a really inclusive vision for New Jersey, and building on some great successes that we've seen in criminal justice reform. In sentencing reform, we're ready to keep pushing the envelope. And so I'm hopeful and acknowledge that there's more work to be done, and we need to realize the win that's at our fingertips.
Right. Well, also, Steal DC's second look law, and we'll come up and help fight for that one.
Yes, please.
Patrice, close us out.
Well, for DC, this is a great time to reach out to the council members. There's only 5 people on our whole committee on the Judiciary and Public Safety, and to ask them, when are you going to start tackling some of these task force recommendations? When are you going to implement that DC Justice Lab proposal to eliminate all mandatory minimums in the city? And hopefully, if we can get some energy around it, it's certainly the simplest law change that's been recommended over the course of the last year, and something that there's no reason to wait on.
And are you optimistic? This council has supported reform. Are you cautiously optimistic?
I'm always optimistic that people want to do the right thing, especially when it's evidence-based. It's just a matter of where the pressure is being put in a given moment. They introduce a lot of law here, and a lot of it dies in committee. And so the community has to stay engaged and follow through. And I'm committed to doing that. And I hope a lot of other people too. And I hope I can lean on folks out of state to come here when we need that support.
Yeah. And well, thank you for that. And thank you all. I just want to say, this matters. When we saw the tough on crime laws pass in the states like dominoes in the 80s and 90s, it matters what happens in these other states. And so part of the reason we want to highlight what happens in these different states is we'll have people watching who live, somewhere else, and they wonder, well, why can't I have this in my state? Well, now you're going to have examples of what's happening, and you're going to be able to say to your lawmakers, they did it. It was fine. They're better off, they're safer, and and their families are intact. And so we just want this movement to grow. And so we're grateful for all the good work you all are doing in your states. And anybody who's watching, get in touch with FAMM. You can text FAMM to 21333 and get involved in your state and start pushing your lawmakers to consider repealing mandatory minimums or making other smart changes. So thanks again to our great panel. Thanks to our team who put this together, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.